Good evening. I'm Claire Schubert, and on behalf of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, I'd like to welcome you and thank you all for joining us tonight as we continue to celebrate Women's History Month with the Gerald R. Ford Library and Museum. Tonight, we'll be highlighting the impact of First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy, as illustrated in the beautiful book, Designing Camelot, The Kennedy White House Restoration and Its Legacy by James Archer Abbott and Elaine Rice Bachman. We'd like to extend a special thank you to our friends at the White House Historical Association for their partnership on this program. And with that, I'll turn it over to the Executive Director of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library and Museum. Welcome, Brooke Clement.
Thanks, Claire. As Director of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library and Museum, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's virtual book talk. A bit of history. The White House Historical Association has been publishing books since 1962 under the direction of Mrs. Kennedy, the association's founder. This evening, authors James Archer Abbott and Elaine Rice Bachman will discuss her renovations to the White House. James Archer Abbott is the Executive Director of the Lewis Historical Society in Lewis, Delaware. Abbott has served as Director of Johns Hopkins University's Evergreen Museum and Library, Curator of the American and European Decorative Arts for the Baltimore Museum of Art, and the Curator and Educator for the National Trust for Historic Preservation, Boscobel House and Gardens, and Historic Hudson Valley. Elaine Rice Bachman is the Deputy State Archivist of Maryland and the former Director and Curator of Artistic Property at the Maryland State Archives. She has written and lectured widely on Maryland's state-owned art collection and the history of the Maryland State House. Elaine currently serves as the Secretary of the State House Trust. Please join me in welcoming Jim and Elaine to our virtual stage.
Good evening.
Good evening.
I know that I speak for both Jim and myself when I say how pleased we are to be invited by the Ford Foundation Library and Museum to be with you tonight. And before I share my screen, or as I share my screen, I hope that you'll indulge me for a little bit of an anecdote from my own office here behind me. On my wall, as an 8-year-old in 1976, I was rather enamored of President Ford, and I imagine caught up in the election of that year. And I wrote to him, and I believe my letter said that I would, if I were old enough, I would be voting for him. And he wrote me back this letter, which I have had on my wall as long as I've had professional office. And I don't think I'm exaggerating to say that it was then Gerald Ford who really inspired and fostered my interest and fascination with the White House. And it's particularly gratifying to be here today to speak with all of you. I'm very grateful to President Ford for writing me back, and it was a real honor to be in the Capitol when he was lying in state and be able to share this anecdote with his son, Steve, who was so graciously greeting people who came into the Capitol that evening. But of course, we're going back even further tonight to 1961 and the beginning of the Kennedy administration. And I think, to think back on when the Kennedys came into office, and here they are on their way, walking on a very bitter cold day in Washington to the inauguration, President Kennedy in top hat with Mrs. Kennedy in her cloth coat. The inauguration itself really ushered in this era of style and glamour. I mean, right down to the inauguration itself with Robert Frost giving a poem, then moving into the White House with their young family, really revolutionizing entertainment and dining in the White House. So much about the Kennedys really exuded a style, a youthful glamour. But nowhere did Mrs. Kennedy focus her attention more than on the rooms that she and her family were moving into. Here you see a view of the Red Room as it appeared during the prior administration, during the Eisenhower administration. And while it on its face looks like a rather lovely room with a sparkly chandelier and nice furnishings, there really isn't anything historical or evocative about it that exudes the history of the White House beyond the subjects of the paintings. And Mrs. Kennedy herself really pointed to a visit that she made when she was 11 years old as a tourist in the White House, when she went through with her mother and her sister, and she just remembered shuffling through and not really feeling like there was any history of the place. She said that Mount Vernon and the National Gallery of Art made a far greater impression on her. So when she moved into the house, she knew that it was going to be her project to try to improve the historical integrity of the White House. This is an image of Mrs. Kennedy shortly after she moved into the house. It's a reception with wives of newspaper editors, and I think it really is a way to sort of imagine how the whole country was sort of gazing at this young first lady, only 31 years old, so stylish, moving into this house. And she really took that enormous popularity that she was gaining in her new role and transferred that to the project that she was about to begin in the White House. It was only a month after she moved into the White House in February of 1961 that she issued a press release announcing that there would be a fine arts committee to restore the White House. And Jacqueline Kennedy was a very savvy woman who was getting very good advice. And the advice was that she needed to have a committee. She needed a structure around what she was trying to do. Because I think it's very important to note that she was not the first lady to attempt to restore the White House or to bring antiques into the White House. There were some other very significant efforts earlier on in its history. However, all of them failed for whatever reason to really have any longevity because there wasn't any foundation beneath them, not any laws behind them, and not a real structure. So Mrs. Kennedy knew that if she was going to put her efforts into restoring the White House and making it more of a historical museum, she needed to have a foundation. And she looked to Henry DuPont, the founder of the Winterthur Museum in Delaware, his home in Delaware, which was filled with hundreds and thousands of antiques that he had put into period rooms. And he had opened that museum as the first museum of American decorative arts in 1951. And by 1961 had also established a graduate program in American decorative arts. So Henry DuPont was really the foremost Americana collector in the country, perhaps even the world. And he had the reputation, he had the connections, as did Mrs. Kennedy among her society friends, that together they could put together a committee that could be the primary donors and the primary really organizers of an effort to bring antiques into the White House. And at the top there at the right is Mrs. Kennedy visiting Winterthur. That's John Sweeney in the glasses giving her a tour. That was Mr. DuPont's curator of the White House of Winterthur. And then below, this is Mr. DuPont on the left with Charles Montgomery, the first director of the museum. And at left, Mrs. Kennedy on May 8th, 1961, when she made her first and only visit to Winterthur to really see for herself what Mr. DuPont had done there and to model the White House rooms after that. With very great enthusiasm, the committees were formed and began creating a list of objects that were desirable for the White House. For the most part, it was Mr. DuPont who went through room by room with Mrs. Kennedy and her staff and sort of identified what they thought could be improved based on what was there and what would be the most desirable things to have. And of course, there was no budget for this. Within 2 weeks of moving into the White House, Mrs. Kennedy had spent the entire $50,000 that she was allotted for the interiors of the White House on just the private rooms. So they had to find a way to have donations, both of money and objects, and of course time, to make this happen. And what you see here is Mrs. Kennedy turning around to speak to Mr. DuPont in the green room of the White House during a tea for the Special Committee for Paintings for the White House, which was chaired by James Fosberg, who is sitting with her on the settee here in the green room. This is on December 5th, 1961. Now, there were very few formal meetings of this committee. Most of their work was done by a few individuals who had a particular interest in helping Mrs. Kennedy, which James will tell you more about. And for the most part, this committee really served as people around the country who could solicit donations. And very loosely organized. Of course, one of the primary reasons that those earlier efforts to restore the White House and to bring antiques into its interior and have meaningful interior design, was failed because there was no permanent collection within the White House. In the past, anything that had gone out of style would either go off to auction or be carried off in some other way or put into storage. There was no curatorial control over the collection. So one of the first things that Mrs. Kennedy did in March of 1961 was appoint the first White House curator. And this is Lorraine Waxman Pierce, shown here. She was a recent graduate of the Winterthur program. She had been recommended by Charles Montgomery and Mr. DuPont for this post. And so Lorraine was discharged down to the White House. She and her husband, John Newton, he was actually John Newton Pierce. He was an assistant curator at the Smithsonian. They lived in Washington, had a young child. It was a big press moment when the first curator was hired, and it was found to be a woman who had a young child. That seemed to be quite a novelty, that a woman in that position would have such a big professional position. But Lorraine really came into the White House into a job that had no scope of work, no precedence. And she and Mrs. Kennedy really set about to look all around the house and first of all, find out what was of value that was already there that should be retained, and then to oversee this very growing collection of acquisitions that were quickly coming into the house. Here you see a ground floor storeroom that was turned into a curatorial workroom, just to give you an idea of the volume of objects that started coming into the house once Mrs. Kennedy's program was announced and efforts were underway. Here, Mrs. Kennedy and Mrs. Pierce on the left going through some acquisitions coming into the house, and on the right, a conservator cleaning up a bust of George Washington. I think what was a really fascinating thing for Lorraine Pierce and Mrs. Kennedy to do early on was simply to go through the house and find out what was of value that maybe was unknown or had been put into storage. And some real treasures were uncovered during that process. Something here, this is a pier table, part of a large suite of furniture purchased by President Monroe for the Blue Room in the early 19th century. This is a pier table made by Pierre-Antoine Bélanger, which you'll see more about when we talk about the Blue Room later in the program. It was a very important suite of furnishings that just over time had been alienated from the room. And Mrs. Kennedy very famously found this pier table being used as a sawhorse in the White House carpentry shop, or at least that was the story. It is true that things such as this were tucked in storage throughout both the White House and in their storage facilities. Also, there were acquisitions that came in unsolicited just from the public. When Mrs. Kennedy's program was announced, newspapers around the country were talking about this project and what she was looking for. And a woman in Iowa, Louise Noun, donated a very what was believed to be an early 19th century Baltimore ladies' desk, very early on in the restoration project, and it was placed in the green room to much celebrity during the television tour when Mrs. Kennedy stopped and told the story of its acquisition. After a while, it was understood, it was under more close examination, it was revealed to be a later 20th century reproduction, so it was removed from the house. But it gives you an idea of the kind of scrutiny then that was placed on the objects as more curatorial study was done. There was also acquisition of wallpaper, very famously antique wallpaper made by the Zuber Company, French, early 19th century French wallpaper, was taken from a house in Thurmont, Maryland, and offered to the White House because it was a very early historic period wallpaper. And the committee agreed to purchase it for something like $12,500. And this is one of those cases where the press really paid attention to so much money being paid for old wallpaper, which you can see was in a somewhat deteriorated condition. And that is where having someone like Mr. DuPont, who had the gravitas to defend such a purchase, could say that even though new paper in the same pattern was still available at a fraction of the cost, it was important that the historical wallpaper be brought into the White House, a place of such historical integrity. This is the wallpaper itself being installed in the diplomatic reception room. There was so much popularity with Mrs. Kennedy's project that people really wanted to be involved and be associated with it. And this led to some very important gifts into the White House collection. Here you have 5 paintings of Native Americans done in the early 19th century by Charles Bird King, being presented to Mrs. Kennedy by the president of the Sears Roebuck Company. There's an interesting story behind these. They were actually sourced by the actor Vincent Price, who himself was an art connoisseur, who recommended that these paintings be acquired for the White House and enabled the Sears Roebuck Company to provide them to Mrs. Kennedy. These were the first images of non-whites on the walls of the White House, I believe. And they were hung on the 2nd floor in the private area where the Kennedys often entertained. One of the other really smart things that Mrs. Kennedy did, and that she really had to advocate for against the wishes of many of her husband's advisors, was the creation of a guidebook for the White House. She felt it was important that if people were going to come to the White House, there should be something that they could take away that had accurate information, a souvenir that could really feature the history of the house. So early on, she advocated for a guidebook to be made. And there were those who felt that it was going to be something tacky, that it would be tacky to sell things at the White House. But she persevered and in fact made it really the goal of the first curator, Mrs. Pierce, to write the text for this book, which ultimately was finished, completed in August of 1962, although in the end there were multiple writers, and in fact we believe Mrs. Kennedy herself was the principal editor. But this sold like hotcakes. Here you see it being sold by staff of the newly formed White House Historical Association, which was the nonprofit organization that was created to sell the new guidebook, and it is still in print today and extremely popular. But it was sold in 1961 for $1 a copy. They very quickly went through their first printing of something like 600,000 copies, and it was enormously popular with visitors. Visitation itself to the White House nearly tripled during the Kennedy years. And so the White House went from a house to a museum in a sense, with here an example in the green room, a very short-lived sort of placard with catalog information about the objects in the room, striking that balance between a private house used by the president and his family and a tourist attraction, which of course it was becoming based on the great popularity of Mrs. Kennedy's project. The public fascination with what Mrs. Kennedy was doing really culminated on February 14th, 1962, when a tour of the White House with Mrs. John F. Kennedy aired on CBS. It was ultimately aired on all 3 networks and watched by over 80 million people. I can't underestimate the impact this had on the public, seeing really for the first time a televised tour of the White House, many people for the first time hearing Jacqueline Kennedy's voice as she described the house and its furnishings. And what many people really may not have understood is how much this was really her own research and her own narration in the tour. CBS really had only one brief meeting with her before the tour. They set up cameras for 2 days, and on the Monday of filming, she showed up, and they had 1 day to get all her takes, and she was a one-take wonder, and had really decided the route of the tour and decided which objects would be discussed. So this tour, which remains, has really sealed her in American memory as the woman, the first lady who brought beauty and history to the White House, really is the culmination of her efforts. Although what the public was seeing really belied a lot of behind the scenes intrigue and a lot of other players who weren't so well known to the public. So for that portion of the story and the continuation, I will now pitch to James.
Thank you, Elaine. I'm going to be a little antiquated in my technology, so we'll go to the very next slide, if you don't mind. And it's important to identify other players in the project. The Kennedys moved into the White House much like President and Mrs. Ford moved in, where they basically closed down a house and they brought all of their furnishings, all of their personal possessions. And so the house in Georgetown that the Kennedys had owned was sold. And the White House really was treated as not a temporary residence, but full-time. All of their books, all of their paintings. So with that, they actually employed Sister Parrish, shown on the right here in this image by Aaron Schickler. Sister Parrish was a society decorator. She had worked on the Kennedys' Georgetown residence in the late 1950s, 1958, 1959. And she was brought to the White House by Mrs. Kennedy with the intent that she would become the broker, the project manager for all of the different participants and their contributions of the White House restoration. And Sister Parrish, well known, although it is important to note that American newspapers heard Sister Parrish and they assumed that it was a Catholic nun that had been employed to be the decorator of the White House. Sister Parrish really felt that she was going to be the chief tastemaker, but the Kennedys actually employed others. And next slide, please. And among them was a very good friend of Jacqueline Bouvier from the early 1950s, named Jane Larkin Wrightsman, or Mrs. Charles B. Wrightsman. Many of you perhaps are familiar with the Wrightsman galleries at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Mrs. Wrightsman became really a curator in her own right, a great connoisseur, very knowledgeable. And she was more or less a person who would make things happen for Mrs. Kennedy, the vision of the White House. It is believed that she is the one who directed the outreach to Henry DuPont and Winterthur. And she also employed or directed Mrs. Kennedy to reach out to Maison Janssen, which was a very important international design house that started in the 1880s, still in existence. And we'll go to the next slide. And in particular, Jane Wrightsman wanted Jacqueline Kennedy to use Stephan Boudin, who was the retiring president of the firm. Now, Stephan Boudin was a decorator, and he designed most of the prominent stage sets for world affairs of the 20th century. And this is no exaggeration. He created the Windsor style in all of the different residences of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. He designed most of the palaces for the royals of Belgium, Egypt, England, or he contributed to the English residences, and to the Spanish court. And then with that, he also designed many of the significant social interiors, such as the Wrightsman's residence in Palm Beach, the New York apartment, and he was involved with the early plannings of the Wrightsman galleries. Now, Mrs. Wrightsman wrote an introductory letter to Stephan Boudin, and she noted in 1958 that my friend doesn't have a lot of money, but P.S., who knows, someday her husband may be president of the United States. And indeed, we know that became true in 2 years, the election of JFK. And actually, Stephan Boudin was a visitor to the White House before Mrs. Kennedy had her official meeting with Henry DuPont. And actually, a newspaper did get wind of this, and Boudin was interviewed, and he said, contrary to what many people believe, I was not smuggled into the White House and rolled up in a carpet, meaning he was not smuggled into the White House like Cleopatra was smuggled in to see Caesar, but instead, what his role was to be just an advisor, but indeed he would become the formulator of the themes, the schemes that Mr. DuPont, Sister Parrish, and others would contribute to. The next slide, please. Janssen really won clients over with their meticulous process. For each room, they would make a miniature of the room, of the scheme. This is a surviving maquette that Elaine is actually including in an exhibition soon to open at Winterthur that Boudin had created for Jane Wrightsman and the New York apartment of the Wrightsmans, with what was then believed to be a Tiepolo mural in the ceiling. So what was great about these little maquettes is that you charmed the client. They were able to take the entire architectural envelope that would be created for them and hold it in their hand, much like a god creating a world. And with that, there was a sort of a reinvention of the grandeur of the Bourbon court and thinking about Marie Antoinette, Louis XVI, and how decorators, designers, ebonists, etc., would woo the monarchs of France in the 18th century to expand the palaces, to make them grander. The next slide, please. And certainly there were the personal rooms that Boudin was involved with. He took what had been a painted dressing room, painted in off-white by Sister Parish, and he lined the walls in blue silk, and he created these trompe-l'oeil doors, or to fool the eye doors, where what appears to be an open cabinet is actually closed. And the illusion is that all of the artifacts that you see on the shelves are personal artifacts that were owned by John F. Kennedy and Jacqueline Kennedy. So impressed was President Kennedy by these wardrobe doors that Mrs. Kennedy would be having her hair done for a state dinner that evening, and he would be bringing the foreign guests into her dressing room just to show these wonderful tributes to the Kennedys' lives. Next slide, please. President Kennedy's Oval Office. President Kennedy made the Oval Office what it is today, which is a photo opportunity. President Eisenhower, President Truman, President Franklin Roosevelt basically used the Oval Office for press, meeting with the press. John F. Kennedy and Jacqueline Kennedy bring in comfortable sofas. It's through Sister Parish. They create this very informal living room environment in front of the fireplace that puts heads of state at ease. But Sister Parish used basically the draperies, the carpet from President Truman and President Roosevelt, and President Truman and President Eisenhower. And President Kennedy's new Oval Office, which Stéphane Boudin worked with the president for 2 years on, was in the process of being installed during November 22nd, 1963, when his motorcade was driving through the streets of Dallas. So he never got to see the completed room that you see in the right image. Next slide, please. But what they did do, the Kennedys and Boudin, with Mr. DuPont and with Sister Parish, but really led by Stéphane Boudin, they created this fabulous Empire Red Room, which would become the room that President and Mrs. Kennedy would host visiting heads of state after a state dinner. So when every other guest was going to the East Room for a musicale or a concert, there would be a brief period when the president and first lady would sit in this room with portraits of great Americans on the walls and this wonderful cerise silk that everyone looked good in the reflected glow. And this is where the president and first lady were able to engage the visiting heads of state. The next slide, please. Another view of that room showing a fabulous Aubusson carpet, which Mrs. Kennedy was able to get a donor to pay $50,000 for. And how she did it, she just basically agreed to have lunch with a gentleman who liked to have lunch with beautiful ladies. The next slide, please. The Blue Room was transformed into a Napoleonic tent room. That wonderful pier table that Elaine showed us is restored and placed in the room. A chair from the suite, an armchair, and then 2 side chairs were acquired, given to the White House, and then subsequent reproductions were added. The intent was the Blue Room became a very elegant, the premier reception room. It's not arranged with sofas and chairs drawn in, not at this time, but instead it is a room that one is intended to stand and to greet and to talk with the president and first lady. The next slide, please. And Mrs. Kennedy certainly played games with regards to American manufactured silks versus European manufactured silks. In 1961 and 62, she had to be very careful about noting that she was using American silks, American carpets, American paints. But by 1963, when the Blue Room was unveiled, she was allowed to use Tassinard and Châtel, a French manufacturer, a silk for the upholstery of the chairs in the Blue Room. And what transformed is that in 1961-62, there was a great political risk for President Kennedy. But by 1962 into 63, Mrs. Kennedy had won the support of the American people. Americans were fascinated by what was happening in the White House. And so that concentration on American-made goods was no longer an issue. The next slide, please. The Vermeil room, which was a knotty pine ground floor room displaying gilt silver given to the White House in the mid-1950s by Margaret Thompson Biddle. Boudin resurrected a finish that he had introduced at Leeds Castle in England. So you have a detail of the bedroom of Lady Bailey of Leeds Castle on the right, and then you have his transformation of the knotty pine walls to mimic those the great interior at Leeds Castle. The next slide, please. The Yellow Oval Room was created in large part by Stéphane Boudin, although this is a room where Sister Parish drew the line. She insisted that if she found the donor for a room, that she would be credited for the room. So although Boudin found most of the furniture, the chandelier, the lighting fixtures, and he even designed the draperies, he did agree to allow Sister Parish to take credit for the entire space. Now, she did design the carpet with the white fringe, and she did select the yellow wall color. But this was a partnership, and this emphasizes the politics of presidential decor, because you had two designers, one American and you had one who was French, and Americans would still be sensitive. Maybe Mrs. Kennedy could use French silks, but it was doubtful that she could use a French decorator. And in fact, Boudin said that. He said he understood that the Americans did not want a Frenchman decorating a White House, just as much as the French would not welcome having an American decorate Élysée Palace where the French president lived. The next slide, please. And Mrs. Kennedy was concerned about every detail. For instance, ashtrays, drink tables. So she had Janssen design these tables that were commissioned for cocktails. This is on the left, you have a photograph of President and Mrs. Kennedy receiving American Nobel Prize winners over the years for a wonderful event in 1962. It's the event that President Kennedy said, this is probably the greatest gathering of talent ever held in the White House, with the exception of when Thomas Jefferson dined alone. But here we have one of two tables that Mrs. Kennedy did commission for the president and first lady and their guests. Next slide, please. And some of the rooms would be more stylish, more chic. This is a little sitting room known as the Queen's sitting room off of the Rose guest bedroom, the Queen's bedroom, where the walls and draperies and furniture were upholstered in a French printed cotton. Next slide. This is the one room that's still intact as far as I know. The red room being used by Mrs. Kennedy to receive foreign visitors after her husband's assassination. This was her favorite room. And so she made sure that this would be the backdrop, this would be the memory that she would have when departing the White House, that this French Empire inspired interior would be her farewell. The next slide, please. She did add a few things before she left the White House, among them two plaques, one on the mantelpiece in the First Lady's bedroom and one on the right in the President's bedroom that I believe is still in place. And they identify that the rooms were used by John F. Kennedy. In the President's bedroom, it says this room was used by President John F. Kennedy during the 2 years, 10 months, and 2 days he was President of the United States. And in the First Lady's bedroom, which he did share, contrary to belief, the President and First Lady did share what is known as the First Lady's bedroom, two separate mattresses, two telephones. It was basically their room. And there would be a separate plaque on the mantelpiece identifying that both President and Mrs. Kennedy used that interior. Next slide, please. I just thought it would be interesting to see Mrs. Ford or the Fords using the Kennedy interiors. Mrs. Ford was very fond of the Queen's room. And in fact, there was a redecoration that was scheduled for the bicentennial to be overseen by the then White House curator, Clement Conger. And Mrs. Ford asked for it to be delayed as long as possible because she loved the Kennedy scheme, which you see in the upper right photograph. And on the left, she's obviously using the telephone in that room. Mrs. Ford knew these rooms. President and Mrs. Ford, Congressman and Mrs. Ford knew the Kennedy interiors. And I think Mrs. Ford had an affinity for the stylish early 1960s Janssen/Sister Parish compositions. The next slide, please. Most controversial decision on Mrs. Ford's part would be the removal of a Kennedy-installed scenic wallpaper in the president's dining room, a second floor dining room that had been installed by the Kennedys so that the first family would never have to use a state floor room to take meals. But Mrs. Ford found the representation of the American Revolution rather depressing. And so to receive the Queen of England and Prince Philip during their visit in 1976, the Fords by that time had removed the wallpaper and had the walls painted a pale yellow. The next slide. But Mrs. Ford did use the Queen's sitting room. She loved the intimacy of that blue and white interior. And she also loved the historicism of what was known as the Victorian Treaty Room, which now serves as a presidential study. So with this, interiors change, but hopefully you have a great sense of how the Kennedy interiors really set a standard by which all succeeding administrations have applied decor to represent the ambitions, the personal likes, dislikes of a president and first lady. And I'd like to bring Elaine back in and we'd be glad to answer questions, etc.
Well, thank you for that, Jim and Elaine. This was very, very interesting and educational. And I want to remind our audience that they can submit questions. There is a question box, Q&A box on your screen. So please feel free to send in your questions. In the meantime, I can get us started with one question that came in from John, who's joining us from Kentucky this evening. What was the original vision for the restoration of the White House, and does the vision continue today?
Elaine and I will have different takes on this. Jane Wrightsman and Jacqueline Kennedy had a real sense of the French influence on early American presidents. For instance, Jane Wrightsman was negotiating the acquisition, actually, of tapestries that had been commissioned by Louis XVI before his beheading for presentation to George Washington. And she wanted those on the state floor. And Mrs. Kennedy wanted a suite of furniture for the green room that had been used by Thomas Jefferson. And so there was a French fascination, but then you had Henry DuPont. And Elaine, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, I would say what Mrs. Kennedy initially wanted to do was just feature the earliest period of occupancy for the house, which was a pretty standard philosophy for historic houses. And what Mr. DuPont tried to encourage her to do was look at more of a continuum of life throughout the history of the White House. So while she very appropriately put French furnishings and French influence into those early state parlors, which were originally furnished by President Monroe using French furnishings. That was very period appropriate. But throughout the house, I think ultimately what their goal was that the entirety of the house would reflect its history. For instance, the McKim mead and white architecture of the state dining room and the East Room. They did not want to mask over what was the work of a very significant architect in the early 20th century. So it had to be a balance between that historical integrity, its earliest period of occupancy, but also respecting the changes that had occurred in the house over time.
And Elaine brings up something very interesting about McKim mead and white. And at the time of the Kennedy restoration of the White House, McKim mead and white's great train station in New York, Union Station, was being demolished. And one wonders that if the Kennedy restoration had not been just a couple of years earlier, could Jacqueline Kennedy indeed have made an effort to save Penn Station, Pennsylvania Station. To that, it is interesting that in her February 14th, 1962 tour of the White House, televised tour of the White House, she goes out of her way to talk about McKim mead and white, about the quality of their architectural design, about the importance of their reconfiguration of the president's house, and why their work has a place in history. And I can't help but think that she was trying to pave the way for some aspect of saving Pennsylvania Station.
I apologize. My dog is grousing at me, so we're gonna just hold him for the time being. We have another question coming in from Patricia. What became of the wallpaper that was removed by Mrs. Ford?
Well, the wallpaper, this is what happens with first families, succession of first families. Mrs. Ford removed it. Rosalind Carter came in, and Rosalind Carter reinstalled it in the President's dining room. Now, at that time, I'm not. Keep in mind, at that time, the Fords and the Carters were not the great friends that they would become. So I'm not sure if Mrs. Carter was playing on, well, this was a crime. Why did you take this wallpaper down? I'm going to resurrect it. After the Reagan administration, there were attempts to actually carefully place panels over the wallpaper so it could be preserved, but at the same time, a more sympathetic color scheme could be introduced to the room. And that worked up to a point, but then I think there were some conservation issues that appeared in succeeding administrations. So I'm not sure if the wallpaper is still on the walls or not, but it is still in the collection of the White House.
And that's something I would again point to the legacy of Mrs. Kennedy, because of the laws that were put in place, creating a permanent collection. Even if something is removed from display, it is still retained in ownership. So fashions change, people's tastes change, even wallpaper that's removed is preserved.
Right.
Okay, great. So are decorative changes made to the White House important to our overall understanding of the presidency?
I think they are, but there are examples of presidents losing elections because of redecoration of the White House. The election of 1840, for instance, William Henry Harrison beating incumbent Martin Van Buren. Many people have assigned his loss to an inventory that was read in Congress by Congressman Ogle that basically talked about purchases made by other administrations, not Van Buren, but they more or less made it seem as if Van Buren brought all of this gilded furniture, all of these gold details, living like a king. And when that got into the newspapers, Van Buren was never to overcome the image of being a grand taste maker and a consumer. To that, I think since the Kennedys, it is interesting that the interiors of the White House, there's still a sensitivity to showcasing rooms, redecoration of rooms. And I think that is because you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. So every administration wants to have the interiors reflect their personalities, their ambitions. But you usually don't today, or in our era, you usually do not see the new interiors until the administration that made those changes happen is about to depart. And I think the reason for that is clear, that they don't want it to be controversial. They don't want to be accused of spending money. And all of this redecoration is necessary. Rooms are used in a very heavy manner. And to that, all of these changes are paid for by private sources. They're not paid for by government dollars. And that's how Mrs. Kennedy really, her great contribution was in creating a White House Historical Association, who sells those wonderful books and provides the celebration of the house through scholarship. But the monies made then go to restoration, preservation, acquisitions. The White House Historical Association really makes the White House appear its very best for state occasions, et cetera, and visitors alike, daily visitors. Elaine, I'm not sure if you have something to add to that.
I think that covers it.
I'm going to ask if Lauren could potentially pull up one of Jim's slides with regard to the Oval Office.
Oh, the Oval Office
redecoration.
Yes.
Because we have a question on that. So you described the Oval Office as it was, and then as it became. Did Johnson completely change it again? So just a question on that.
Yes, well, actually, Johnson was aghast And President Johnson had to live with this very bright, it was called blood red, strangely enough, blood red carpet until after his election in 1964 and his inauguration, because it was associated with John F. Kennedy. And the Johnsons were so sensitive. They wanted Mrs. Kennedy to be taken care of. They wanted her to stay in the White House as long as she wished, but she departed within 2 weeks after the assassination. But with that, President Johnson couldn't change the carpet until after, I believe, after his own election. And he did that by actually reinstating the green carpet that you see on the left. He left the draperies that President Kennedy and Boudin had selected, those white straight falling draperies. And if you go to the Lyndon B. Johnson Library and you see a reduced scaled Oval Office, you'll see the cut down draperies that President Kennedy had approved. They're in that room. Did that answer your question?
I believe it did. I believe it did. Is there a scheduled renovation coming up then, or is that just kind of on an as needed basis?
It's always happening. There's a Winterthur Fellow who is a curator at the White House now, who I'm in frequent contact with. I mean, and Jim knows this, and anytime there's a change in administration, there's changes, often to accommodate those family members. I mean, when the Kennedys moved in, that was the first time young children had lived in that house since Teddy Roosevelt's kids. So you have to make certain accommodations, and fabrics change, certainly fashions change. I imagine there's a lot more change that happens in the private quarters that, as Jim said, we don't see until such time as they're photographed and put out in a design book, which is always greatly exciting at the end of an administration when that particular designer who has worked with the first family publishes their work. And that is something that happens. Nearly every first family has employed a private designer of some sort to work with them.
We have a question. Did President Kennedy support Mrs. Kennedy in her efforts, or was he initially concerned about public response?
Elaine.
He was initially concerned, as all his advisors were, but he did support it. I mean, I think he saw how popular it was. He himself, I mean, they shared a great love of history, both incredibly well read. I mean, I think that together, this was a project that they were very in sync on in terms of how important it was to have historical integrity. And these rooms really became the backdrop for his presidency. And being one of the youngest presidents in history, to connect himself with the founding fathers, with, the great men of American history, I think that really bolstered the image that he was wanting to present as well. So he was supportive, and in the television tour, when he comes in at the end in the very last scene, that was a very genuine exchange, as she described it, when he expressed how proud he was of the work that she did.
Can you maybe briefly discuss any significant changes that were made during the Obama and/or Trump administrations?
Well, they're more or less ongoing. They can go from one administration to the other. Michelle Obama oversaw the redecoration of what is known as the family dining room on the first floor, which is basically redesigned by McKinley and White in 1902. But it was, I think it may still be intact. It represents modern art. So it's the first chance really to have modern contemporary pieces displayed on the state floor. A special carpet was woven. It's a very interesting composition, but it's not what Mrs. Kennedy or Mr. DuPont or Stephen Boudin would have envisioned for that space. The Obamas and the Trumps did oversee the restoration of the returned pieces of the Boulanger suite. So they've recently been restored, they've been reupholstered. It was a decade plus long project, but the pieces were unveiled during the Trump administration. My understanding is, well, actually, Mrs. Trump oversaw the design of a carpet for the diplomatic reception room, where that scenic wallpaper that Elaine showcased or spoke about. Melania Trump oversaw the installation, the design and installation of a new carpet. It is important to note that what has happened now is it's ongoing. It's very fluid, and so, instead of looking at the Nixons or the Kennedys, or for that matter, the Fords, redecorating the White House is constantly being primped and being researched and being freshened. And some projects are larger. Michelle Obama also oversaw the redecoration of the state dining room with Michael Smith, interior designer Michael Smith, and former curator Bill Allman, where some chairs that had been purchased by James Monroe, commissioned by James Monroe in 1818, were replicated to serve as new dining chairs. So each administration adds. Now, if you're looking at legacy, right at this point, the legacy that an administration leaves is usually china. It can be a luncheon set, a state dinner service, but that's really how first families leave their marks today. Because right now, the White House is that museum that Jacqueline Kennedy initially envisioned in 1961. It has become so almost like a self-sustaining entity. So what we would think of as the mark of the Bidens or for President Mrs. Trump, chances are there is a contribution to dinner service or to a luncheon service, et cetera.
Do either of you have favorite stories from your research?
Elaine, this may be our last event.
Goodness, we probably do. I think some of the favorite stories I have are just reading the letters between Mrs. Kennedy and Mr. DuPont, and then her letters to Jane Reitzman and Boudin, all about the same issue. And when you put all these things together, you really see how masterful she was in, manipulating is a loaded word, but for a young woman who only had 1,000 days, so much was accomplished. And it really was because she had such a presence of mind in working with all of these different, very opinionated people. So I would just say that the correspondence, the idea of all the letter writing that was done is what is so visceral to me about this project.
And we did send a manuscript to Mrs. Reitzman, who's no longer with us, but and she sent us a wonderful letter back that said, she said, I'm sort of giggling because I had forgotten all the games that we used to play with Mr. DuPont to get our way. So what Elaine is talking about with this series of letters, the French designer, Mr. DuPont, the great American expert, in the end, it was going to be what Jacqueline Kennedy and Jane Reitzman, and we didn't talk about Bunny Mellon, but Mrs. Mellon as well. Mrs. Kennedy was never going to be disappointed. And America benefited from that.
Absolutely. So, could a similar effort to what Mrs. Kennedy did, could that be put in place today, or is that even necessary given what
I don't even think it's necessary. I think that's why she is so sealed with this label as being the woman who did most for the White House. There were certainly more acquisitions that came into the House. Jim, correct me if I'm wrong, during the Clem Conger years.
Right.
There were other years when more things were brought in, but no one could sort of recapture being that first person to really sort of open up the jewel box and invite the public into this project. So thankfully, I don't think it's necessary to be the protectress that she needed to be to create that legislation. But I think absolutely the house it's an old building. It continually needs to be restored, but the foundation she laid is what everything is built on now.
Right. And she did ask in 1963, she did ask the French design firm to come up with schemes, decorative schemes, for the bedrooms that they were using, because as she noted in the memo, the next first lady may not be interested in this project. So it would be great if we could have historically themed schemes ready to go in and put in place. And I also think it's interesting that although we look at decor, many of us will probably assume that decor is superficial, means nothing. Look at the Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis auction at Sotheby's and the catalogs. She, to her dying day, she kept every copy of the White House guidebook. She had every later edition of that guidebook. She kept boxes of fabric samples and maquettes. This was an important project for her. And I think in part because, as Elaine points out, her husband was very proud of her. They had only been married. We missed this. John and Jacqueline Kennedy, at the time of the assassination, had only been married 10 years. And the White House restoration actually served as one of the new bonds between the young, she was 12 years younger, of the young First Lady and the president. He was very proud of her. And I think that that's why she held on to the project. She would always be available to answer questions of the White House curators and for succeeding administrations. She accomplished something. And that seed was not just for the White House. Think about preservation and restoration all around the country. The White House interiors were duplicated time and again in museums and in historic houses because Mrs. Kennedy made history interesting and accessible. And we could actually use a little of that. We could use a revival of that because you learn from history, and it doesn't seem as if we're living in a time where we're actually learning a lot.
I will end on a question with regard to the Fords, and I really appreciate seeing, Mrs. Ford's use of Mrs. Kennedy's design in the Queen's Room. So as you mentioned, Jim, they were both familiar with the interiors that Mrs. Kennedy put in place. Do you think that they identified with the Kennedys over the Nixons? I mean, obviously they came in very quickly in August of 1974. Like, was that something that that they kept in place? Did they keep the Nixon incarnation in place, or did they bring in some more things from the Kennedy administration?
I would say that, well, first off, Mrs. Ford and Mrs. Nixon were very good friends, I guess to say they were political wives. They respected one another and they did communicate and et cetera. But Mrs. Ford is known for really deformalizing entertainment at the White House from the Nixons. Mrs. Nixon brought back white gloves. Mrs. Ford wasn't going to wear those white gloves. And the idea of no longer white linens, but using bright textiles at luncheons and state dinners. I think Mrs. Ford brought a sense of stylish informality to mix with the formality of the White House. And I think it was closer to what the Kennedys had done, that in the idea of the cocktail hour, the idea of using the rooms as backdrop, conversation, the musical performances, et cetera. Although we think of the Kennedys as it's a formal museum, the fact of the matter is that those interiors really did honor their ambitions as a young couple representing a nation. And that's not to downplay the wonderful work that Mrs. Nixon did for the White House, but I don't think that Mrs. Ford wanted to be Mrs. Nixon. And the way she came into the White House, she was actually quite brilliant in how she declared her own autonomy. She did it very quickly. She didn't insult anyone. And I think part of it was in more or less hearkening back to the less formal or 1960s interiors to that. Mrs. Ford was very close with Lady Bird Johnson. And Mrs. Ford's access as the wife of Congressman Ford to the second floor of the White House, those rooms were familiar to her as the wife of a congressman. Lady Bird Johnson did a very interesting thing. Jacqueline Kennedy never would have done this. For the congressional reception, Mrs. Johnson would open up the second floor and the wives of the congressmen could go through any of the rooms, and they did. And so the closed doors that Jacqueline Kennedy had to find suddenly were thrown open, and the wives really took in every aspect of this envelope of Camelot. So maybe that's tied into it as well.
It's absolutely fascinating. I can't thank you both enough for joining us this evening and giving us these amazing insights into the Kennedy restoration at the White House. I believe Claire is going to be coming back on. Yep, here she is. All right. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Many thanks to you, Brooke, to Elaine, and to James for a really incredibly interesting program this evening. And a special thank you to here I'm back again, surprise. A special thank you to Lauren Belting, who is our wizard behind the curtain running technology for us this evening, making this virtual program possible. If you enjoyed tonight's program, I promise you, you will love the book Designing Camelot. It is simply gorgeous and it would make a lovely gift. We invite you to visit shop.whitehousehistory.org to purchase your own copy. Viewers of tonight's program can save 10% until April 15th by entering in the code, all caps, FORDLBRY28. Programs like the one you enjoyed this evening are only possible through the generous support of our members, and we'd love you to join us. If you're interested in becoming a Friends of Ford member, our membership starts at just $35 and gets you free admission to the Gerald Ford Museum and plenty of other benefits while providing support for educational programs like this one that you enjoyed tonight. Please consider joining us and visit GeraldRFordFoundation.org/donate. Once again, a big thank you to tonight's speakers and to all of you for watching at home. Good night.